interesting when we look at some of them going through the study on David, and today we're coming across the individual that is really a sad story, but I think it's one that can really help us. And I think as we're getting older, we're forced to look at our own mortality and things to think about. It's been a couple of months ago. There's a place that I have breakfast with, and one person comes in on occasion. Stan's his name. He's a believer and attends a small Nazarene church. And he had a heart attack. While he was in the hospital, they found out he had cancer as well. And he since has had another heart attack, and it's killed part of his heart. He only has 38% of his heart. That it's functioning, and they can't do anything to save the rest of it. Obviously, it makes you think about it. If you read Walker Moore's article in this paper today, found out that he has stage 4 prostate cancer. And so it's one of those deals you never know at anyone's. And you think, obviously, God can do different things, and you certainly are praying for that. And but again, we don't know when it's going to be. So think about it. I think questions we can ask ourselves was when getting in this age, did I live it as I should have? Another question, changes need to be made? How do I make them, and why do I make them? Interesting questions. It's often, though, it's easier for us to look at somebody else. How many of you find it easier to look at somebody else's life and say, this is what they need to change? You know, it's harder to look at our own life and say, so with that in mind, let's think we'll look at somebody else's life then in Scripture and say what he should have changed, and then maybe we can turn around and apply it to ourselves. If you want a title for the message, Living the Life of a Fool. Living the Life of a Fool. Saul even made that statement in 1 Samuel 24 when he said, I have played the fool. If you want to think about with Saul, I had God on my side, yet I lived as though he didn't exist. I had God on my side, but he lived as though he didn't exist. Because most of the things he was fighting God all the way, doing it his way. So let's think about it. Let's think about some definitions. In Psalms 14:1, if you remember, it says, the fool has said in his heart what? There is no God. So you have a proclaimed fool. It's obviously a pronounced fool. This next statements, which we often call them atheists. A means no, and thesis is God. There's no God. In Luke 12, you remember in verse 19 to 21, Jesus is giving the story of the rich young ruler, and the rich young man, rather, not the ruler, but he had all those things he was building, you remember, and he was running out of places. I'm going to build new barns and bigger barns and do all this. And if you remember, Christ said, you fools, tonight your life will be required of you, and what you have worked so hard for is going to be given to somebody else. You're rich towards yourself and not rich towards God. I like to call that the practicing fool. If you ask the guy, would he have said there's a God? But in practice, was he living like there's a God? In 1 Samuel 26:21, when Saul makes the statement, I have played the fool, that of professing to be a fool. There's a lot of people who are acting like a fool, but they don't profess to be a fool. They don't see it in their life. So I think it's interesting. There is a proclaimed fool, there's a practicing fool, and then there's a professing fool. And so I think we, at different times, we all can do at times, can be a believer, but yet act like a fool. So let's think about it. And a lot of this, since we've been through it with David, going through the story, we won't look at a lot of it till the end. But remember in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1, verse 6, and verse 9, you remember Samuel anointed Saul king. And then it says the Spirit came upon him and changed him. So I think the first part to recognize, even though Saul wasn't the choice of God, God anointed and enabled him to do the job. And so I think it's interesting, God, whenever he gives us a job to do, he will enable us. And what happens to a lot of us, we have tried to do the job before it was time, and it didn't work. So when it is time to do it, what do? We say we can't do it, but God will never ask us to do something that he doesn't enable us to. And he often will not enable you until it is time. We have to step out in faith. And so I think it's interesting when you look about the enabling, What has God called you to do and enabled you to do, and are you doing it? I think a lot of us, God tells us to do things, enable us to do things, but we don't do it. So then, if that's the case, are we not a practicing fool? Because are we not going to have to stand before Him one day? He's told us to do something, but we're acting as if He doesn't exist, and we don't have to give Him an account. So notice, first of all, He's anointed and He's enabled. And then the practicing fool parts that Saul does, he has it several ways. If you remember in 1 Samuel 13 and verse 8 and 9, if you remember, the Philistines are gathering for battle against Saul. And Samuel says to wait 7 days and don't sacrifice until I get there. And remember, the people see how many Philistines they are, and they all start going. Remember, they're deserting, and they're hiding in caves and pits and going everywhere. And Saul is getting very scared. Everybody's leaving. And so what does he do? He offers the sacrifice himself. I always have situation ethics. The ends justifies the means. Saul was not to offer the sacrifice. In his mind, well, I waited 7 days, you haven't shown up, and I'm losing all my people. And if I don't have the people, we're not going to. So the ends justifies the means. How many times as Christians do we do the same thing? We have situation ethics, and we say the ends justifies the means. I'll never forget when I was in high school, I know it was during the dark ages, but there was, if you remember, there was real popular, the Moonies were out on the corners and selling flowers and doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And they had a practice called heavenly deception. I don't know if you knew about it, but they'd be selling flowers. And what they did is they would, say the flowers were $5 and you gave them 20, they'd hand you a 5 back or a 10 back and then hope you didn't notice it. And they said that was okay. It was called heavenly deception. They were keeping the money. That's literally, it is honestly what they had. And they justified it, called it heavenly deception. Well, that's called situation ethics, isn't it? But how many times do we do the same thing as Christians? We have situation ethics where we tell the truth here, we don't tell the truth, we stretch the truth, we do a lot of things like that. So you think about it, does the end justify the means? Should we be relying on anything? I think it's interesting, we think, well, it gets what I want, and or whatever, I only tell people part of the truth, therefore they think it's one way, it's actually another. So I think it's important to recognize it's one of the practices he started right at the beginning, and it was that of situation ethics. You go to chapter 15, remember we saw, in which God told them to wipe out all the Amalekites. You remember the Amalekites, when they were coming from Egypt to the promised land, the Amalekites withstood against them. God is now telling the wickedness is so great, God tells Saul, destroy them completely. Well, Saul, if you remember, he goes and destroys some of it. He doesn't. He brings Agag, and he also brings the best of the spoils. And he doesn't. And then you remember he said, well, I was obedient. While we were doing this, we saved the best of these are for sacrifices. You remember, so Samuel actually killed the Agag. Remember, that's when God makes the statement, it is better to what? Obey than to sacrifice. That's the context. Also, the Amalekites is who hauled David's wives and people off because Saul didn't do his job. So I think it's important for us, how many of us have select obedience? Are there certain commands we obey? And are there certain commands we don't obey? Love everyone as Christ has loved the church. I mean, how many of us are loving people like we should? He doesn't deserve it. No, I love this one, but I won't love that one. Go into all the world, right? Tell people of Christ. We do that. Look at all the different commands. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Most of the time, I think we are practicing fool in the sense that we select what we want to obey. We only want to listen to certain ones. And then we'll have what? When we don't obey the others, we do the situation ethics and give reasons why we don't do it. I think we get so hard on Saul, but I think a lot of times we're a lot more like him than we care to admit. But think about that selected obedience. Which ones do we not do, and what's our reasoning for it? We get on to somebody else when they don't do it, but how many of us are justifying it ourselves? You go a little bit on, and remember in chapter 18, you have this. You remember in chapter 18, we'll look at a couple of these. Let's just look over at 18 for a moment. I think it's interesting. You remember God has taken the kingdom from Saul, and he's anointed David. And if you remember in chapter 18, 1 Samuel, you remember wherever David goes in war, he's having great success. He's killing the Philistines. So in verse 6, you remember they started singing the song and had the instruments and tambourines. And in verse 7, the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Okay, so what should Saul's response have been? Is the enemy being destroyed? Is David working for you? All right, should be. We're rejoicing with the success of somebody else. But notice, in verse 8, Saul became very angry for the saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. You know, it's amazing when you stop and think about it. Suspicious, selfish, and jealous. You go a little bit further, notice in 14, David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. If God is prospering somebody, should we dread, be jealous, or should we be rejoicing and thankful? You stop and you think about it, when David becomes king, and then later, remember, he wants to build the temple. And God said, no, you've been a king of blood so far as all the people you're killing, and your son's going to build the temple. What did David do? In chapter 7 of Samuel, 2 Samuel, he said, okay, Lord. And he went and gathered the materials. I accept your no, and I'm going to help the successor do it for you. Was it ever called David's temple? It's always called what? But could it have not have been called David and Solomon's temple? Because of how much work David... How many of us are willing to say, okay, you're exalting somebody else, you're not exalting me, they replaced me or whatever, and I'm going to work with them. By the way, did Jonathan do that? Yes. But you notice that his father does not. It's really, the selfishness is really, it's amazing when you look at it and how he does it. But think about in our own lives when talking about the selfish. Am I happy to support when others do well? What happens when somebody exceeds at work? They get the promotion and you didn't. What happens if you were also applied for the promotion but you didn't get it? Are you happy for the one that does? It's amazing how many times we are very selfish if we don't get our way rather than rejoice when God does something for somebody else. I think it's easier to mourn with those that mourn than it is to rejoice with those that rejoice so often because they're jealous. But again, that's what Saul. If God's truly in charge of things, why should we be jealous? Another one I think it's interesting, you have this, it's in chapter 18 all the way through 26, is self-rule or God rule. Did Saul know that God had taken the kingdom from him? Did Saul work with that at all? No. If you remember in chapter 18, you remember whoever killed the Goliath was promised what? His daughter, right? Did David get his daughter? Gave it to somebody else. Then in chapter 18, Saul is suspicious of him and says, well, I really shouldn't kill him, so I'm going to say if he goes out and kills 400 Philistines, and maybe one of the Philistines are going to kill him while he's trying to kill them, then I won't have killed him, and it'll work just fine. So then David goes and does that, and he gets Micah, and then you remember she is then taken from him, Michal, and given to another. You have the same thing. What about Jonathan? By the way, did he try not to kill David twice with a spear? Jonathan protects him. And then Saul gets mad at Jonathan and tries to spear his own son against the wall because he's going against. Jonathan recognizes what God is doing and that David's the man and not him as the successor. And you'll notice then Saul tries to change God's way by not only killing his son, but killing him. What did he do with the 85 priests? Killed them. You think about it, what happens when you, in chapter 24 and also in chapter 26, when David's running around all over, he's chasing him. Amazing, in 24 he even says, you're going to be king, so promise me that you won't kill my ancestors, or my descendants rather. David says he won't, and then in 26 he's back out hunting him again. Well, if he knows that he's the promised guy and that God's on his side, why in the world are you trying to go against God and kill him because you know you can't succeed? But how many of us are trying to change God's plan for our life or for somebody else? I never forget when I taught school how many times when people really felt called into the ministry or in some form or whatever, and the parent would say no. And then make the statement, you can't make a living at it. You need to go off and do this. You're going to be follow my footsteps as a lawyer, a doctor, or whatever it might be. It's happened over and over and over again. And you think about what happens as a parent when you're doing those kind of things. What you're saying what? And the child's wanting to be obedient to you? And the predicament you're putting that person in. So I think it's important to recognize, is it self-rule or is it God's rule? And so often, how many of you have a plan, and you've already laid out your plan for your life, and now you're telling God to bless it? Any of you ever done that? One. Okay. And how many of us have even now? We have a vision for our retirement or for whatever it might be, and we have this self-rule, and we don't ever ask God. There's nothing wrong with making plans, according to James, but it then says, if what? The Lord wills. Allow Him to make it. Paul planned on going to Spain. According to Scripture, the best we know. Did he ever get there? No. If he had gone to Spain, do you think he would have had success? I'm talking about if the Lord allowed him to. But would he have had as much success as he did in writing the 4 books while he was in prison? So God had a different plan, and God really, it's amazing. So I think the question again comes down with Saul, all the way through self-rule versus God's rule. You remember, how long was he king? He becomes king when he's 40. He was king for how many years? 32 years. Of those 32 years, how many of them was he following the Lord? And how many of them was he following his own way? You think about it. So far, did he do situation ethics? Do you think he was justifying trying to kill David, trying to kill Jonathan, all these things? Okay, what about the select obedience? He obeyed when it was beneficial to him. Was he suspicious and selfish? Every time somebody was doing something, always suspicious all the time. Self-rule or God's rule, and I think it's important. Do I accept God's rule or do I try to manipulate? Any of you ever try to manipulate things? How many of you remember when your kids were real small and they wanted something from you? And so they'd bring you a cup of coffee, or they'd bring you, oh, Dad, you look hot, here's a drink. Mine were really good about coming when they'd come to work with me. Gene would bring them down. I'd be mowing and it'd be really hot. They'd be with me about 15 minutes. Dad, you look so hot. You need a drink. Well, if I go get a drink, then what? They get a drink. But they learned enough not to say, Dad, I want a drink. You need a drink. So then guilt would set in and Dad would buy me a drink. See? Situation ethics. That takes us then to today where we're in 28. You remember you have the situations taking place. So I like to call it silence. You have the background is in verse 3 to 5. I don't think we really appreciate the background as much as we should. But notice Samuel is dead, so notice Saul can't go to Samuel. And notice then what happens is you have Saul had also removed from the land the mediums and spiritists, which he was supposed to do. He was commanded to do that, and Scripture says to do it, and early in his career he did it. But then notice in verse 4 of 28, the Philistines are gathered on one side, and you have Saul and his men on the other side. And what happens is most people don't look at where this took place. This is actually, notice it says in the plains of Jezreel, which would be open land. In fact, Alexander the Great called it the greatest natural battlefield in the world. Now, if you have chariots and you have all the modern weaponry of that day, who would be at advantage in an open area? The Philistines would. You have Saul on one side, and the Philistines on the other, where all their weapons would be, and they're greatly outnumbered. So how are you going to feel going into battle when they have superior weapons, more of it, and you go? Okay? Now, if it had been like Hezekiah, if you remember with Sennacherib, we saw that 3 times in Scripture. It refers to it in Scripture what Hezekiah did. Remember, Hezekiah humbled himself, asked God for protection. God, it's your city. You'll have to protect it. You know Saul doesn't. But anyway, so let's look at the silence that you have. So in 6 and 7, Saul inquires of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or Urim or the prophets. Okay, so he's asking what to do, and obviously God has rejected him. But anywhere does it ever say that Saul confessed? No. You never find Saul confessing. So the battle is coming. It's going to be the next day. So Saul then, notice he then asks, is there any spirit that's around or medium? And you'll find that's only 6 miles away. And notice, how did these servants know about the medium that was there? He had killed most of them. But for the last how many years is he chasing David everywhere? You think maybe he should have been chasing and killing the spiritist who was this close to where he was at. That's what Scripture said for him to do. So rather than do what he should have been doing, he's chasing David and trying to kill him. And we know from Scripture he never should have gone to her to begin with. So he goes to the spiritist. And the spiritist, normally when they would ask, and notice he then is talking to her, he disguises himself and brings 2 people. And they ask her in verse 8 to bring up someone. Verse 9, the woman said, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? Saul vowed to her, the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, there shall be no punishment come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel. Now notice then, what would normally would have happened is there'd be a demonic person imitating or whatever would be brought up. And they can imitate voices, they can imitate even how they look. You can find that because even with Scripture it does not say you can entertain angels unaware. I mean, if I saw somebody walking down the street and it had, had wings on and everything else, I would say, what? It's an angel. I can see that. But if they're dressing like a human being and everything else, same thing happened even with Sodom and Gomorrah. Did they recognize when they came? No. So notice then what happens is when she brings up Samuel in verse 12, why she screamed. Because God allowed Samuel to actually come. And that surprised her, and she screamed because Samuel, what would he have said? Did he not say to kill the spiritist? And here's Samuel standing there. So she screamed because this would not have been what she would have normally have seen. God miraculously allowed Samuel to come. And notice what Samuel now has to say. The king says in verse 12, she recognizes it's Saul, and she's scared because obviously Saul was supposed to kill him, and now what's Saul going to do? Is it situation ethics again with Saul? I should kill you, but I'm not going to. Notice 13, the king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said, Saul, I have a divine being coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, what is this form? And she said, an old man who's coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Notice he wouldn't have been doing that to a spirit. But notice in 15, Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I'm greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and answers me no more, neither through prophets or dreams. Therefore I have called you that you may make known to me what I should do. So he's asking him the question, and Samuel is now about to answer him. Samuel said, "Why then have you asked me, since the Lord has departed from you, and you have become your adversary? The Lord has done according as he has spoken through me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands, and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey the Lord, and did not execute his mercy, his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Talking about in death, obviously. "Indeed, the Lord will give you over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Did he want to know what was going to happen? Did he get the answer he wanted? Okay, if you were Saul, then you stop and you think about this, the silence. Should he have gone to the spiritist? Okay, now that he knows what's going to take place, what would be an appropriate response of Saul? Do you think a confession would be in place? Do you think, which by the way, you look later at some of the kings later, whether it be Hezekiah or whatever, you have others that prayed to God and received mercy. Does he ask for mercy? What about his sons? What did Jonathan, did he ever pray for his sons? No. You think about it, silence. God's telling him what's going to happen, and he does not ask for mercy. Isn't that why Jonah fled? Because he says God was a merciful and gracious God, and he didn't want him to forgive the Nineveh. God is the same, but he doesn't ever want to ask for it. So you think about it, here you have the silence that you have with Saul. And so notice then in verse 20, Saul immediately falls upon the ground. He's greatly afraid. There's no strength in him. He hadn't eaten all day and all night. If you're about to go fight the enemy, you need strength. And it's interesting that the spiritist has mercy on him and basically kills her fatted calf and feeds him. And you'll notice then she brings it to Saul and they eat. And in verse 25, they leave. And you stop and you think about it when he does this. Again, is there any confession on Saul's part? No. Does he care about his sons? You think about it, okay, I've messed up, I've played the fool, he's already said that. But Jonathan hasn't. Why aren't you praying and thinking about those who are after you? It's interesting. So basically the next two chapters it talks about David and what David is doing while this is taking place. If you go to 31, it picks up. Remember, that was the night they left, the next morning. You have the battle that's going to take place. Verse 1 to 6, you have the 3 sons are killed in verse 2. When you think about it, how would you like if you were Saul and look out and see your 3 sons killed? According to the Latin Vulgate, it says in verse 3, the battle was heavy and an archer hit Saul. The Latin Vulgate, we don't know for sure, but it says he was hit in the abdomen. We don't know where, but obviously he knew that he was wounded. He didn't have a medic coming around him. So you stop and you think about it. He knows he's going to die. But notice in verse 4, Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and pierce me through and make sport of me." So he wants his armor bearer to do what? Kill him. Should his armor bearer be killing him? But he wants to die because he doesn't want to face who? The enemy, because they might, if you remember, like for instance with Samson, make sport of him, do different things before they actually kill him or whatever. But when he dies, who's he going to go face? Does he have any concern about facing God after he dies? I mean, that's amazing. You think about it, I'm about to die, and I care more about the enemy who's coming on me than I do about facing God, who I know I'm about to face any minute. That's why I said, he's a professing fool, but he's a practicing fool. I mean, if I know I'm going to face the Lord tomorrow or today, is there any of us going to be, if all of us knew at 6 o'clock tonight God was going to call us home, what would a lot of us be doing this afternoon? How many of us would take a nap? I probably wouldn't take. How many of you have a few phone calls you're going to make? A few visits you're going to make? A few notes you're going to be writing? There's going to be things we're going to want to be doing to give you things, loved ones, people maybe we've wronged, whatever it might be, trying to make it correct. Think about it. And here he is. He doesn't notice that he kills himself, and his armor bearer, then greatly afraid, falls and kills himself. Wouldn't he have been wise to say to his armor bearer, I'm dying, flee for your own life? He didn't care about his armor bearer. He cared only about himself. And notice then, so here he has death with his 3 sons and himself, and then they do make sport of him. If you look in the story, they then cut his head off, and they go send it around to the different cities to display it, and they take their bodies and put them up on the wall. And basically it's shown, this was a practice that was often done. The same thing happened, the Romans would do it. Basically, this is what happens to you if you rebel against us, and the people would see it. What's interesting, what happens is most people don't recognize down in verse 11, down to verse 13, the last 3 verses. You notice some valiant men, they walked all night, would go into the enemy territory. How dangerous would that be? And take the bodies down. Why did they do that? 32 years earlier, one of Saul's first things was he saved the city. He came to their rescue 32 years earlier when he did what was right. And now then they had a chance to return that favor, and they do it. How many of us have had people do something for us, and we get an opportunity, even if it's 32 years later, we are going to repay the favor. Even when it's at a great risk to their own lives. Saul risked his life, and out of respect for what he did for them, they're doing the same thing. I think it's interesting. So, think about some questions for the applications. What am I doing with the job God has enabled me to do? What am I doing with it? Another question, am I a practicing fool who obeys when I want, often using situation ethic? Well, only, practicing fool. Do I accept God's rule, or do anything and everything within my power to have my rule? We kind of like Carrie Underwood's song, when all else fails and we're on a thin ice and we're sliding out of control, we say what? Jesus, take the wheel, and as soon as it comes to a stop, what happens? Move over. It's time for me to start. Right? Do I care more for myself than those who are left behind? No mention anywhere of Saul caring for people left behind. Did he intercede for his kids? Did he intercede for Israel? No. When Christ was going to the cross, did he intercede for his disciples? Did he intercede for us? That's amazing. The last one, do I repay favors when and if I get the chance? It's interesting. It's an article, Baxter, if you know much about Baxter, he was a writer of yesteryear, did a lot of study on biblical characters. He wrote this about what it means to play the fool. A man plays the fool when he neglects his godly friends, as Saul neglected Samuel. A man plays the fool when he goes on enterprises for God before God is sent him, as Saul did. A man plays the fool when he disobeys God, even in seemingly small matters, as Saul at first did. For such disobedience nearly always leads on to a worse fall. A man plays the fool when he tries to cover up his disobedience to God by religious excuses, as Saul did. To obey is better than sacrifice. A man plays the fool when he tries to persuade himself that he is doing the will of God, as Saul tried to persuade himself, when all the time, deep down in his heart, he knows otherwise. A man plays the fool when he has allowed some jealousy or hatred to master and enslave and deprive him, as Saul did towards David. A man plays the fool when he not only fights against God, as Saul did in hunting David, to save his own face. A man plays the fool when he turns from God, from the God he has grieved, and seeks an alternative in spiritism and traffic with spirits and beyond. To the end of all these ways of sin and folly is moral and spiritual suicide. We can only finish such a downward course with the pathetic groan of Saul, "I've played the fool." And I think what happens is a lot of us are getting at the end of our life. But we can turn it around. What are we going to do with the rest of our life? Am I going to be like Saul and play the fool, be a practicing fool even though I say there's a God, but in practice I don't act like it? Do any of us know if we have tomorrow? Then if we don't, then we can face Him, and are we ready to face Him? 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 Are we ready?